The morning sunlight streamed through the classroom windows, casting golden beams across the worn wooden floors of Room 7. The room, a familiar space that had witnessed the comings and goings of countless children over the years, felt peaceful in the early hours before the full hustle of the school day began. The scent of crayons, freshly sharpened pencils, and the slight mustiness of the old bookshelves greeted Miss Eleanor Thompson as she walked between the rows of desks. Her eyes, warm and practiced, took in the children quietly settling into their seats. Some were already chattering, excited to begin their day, while others, more shy, settled into their routines with the assurance of familiarity. Miss Thompson had been teaching for 2 decades, and in all those years, she'd developed a sharp intuition when it came to children. She could read the subtlest shifts in body language, the smallest pauses in speech, and the way a child's eyes flickered when something was wrong. It was almost like a sixth sense, one that allowed her to understand when a child needed attention, even before they could voice it themselves. But today, her focus was drawn to one student in particular, a little girl who had been with her for only 3 days. Lily Harper. She was standing off to the side of the room, her small form rigid and stiff, seemingly unable to settle into one of the chairs like the other students. Miss Thompson noticed this right away, the way Lily's eyes stayed fixed on the floor, as though she was trying to avoid drawing attention to herself. The other children chatted and laughed, their usual morning excitement filling the air, but Lily was an island of stillness in the middle of it all. Eleanor approached the small girl with quiet steps, her heart tightening at the sight of Lily's posture. It wasn't normal for a child to stand the entire time during class, especially for 3 days in a row. Lily's eyes were downcast, and her body was held as though she was bracing herself against something invisible. "Sweetheart," Eleanor said gently, her voice low and calm, "would you like to sit down for our morning story? We're just about to start." Lily's fingers clenched around the hem of her faded blue dress, her small frame tense as she shifted her weight from one foot to the other. Her voice was barely audible when she responded. "No, thank you, Miss Thompson. I just prefer standing." The words were soft, hesitant, almost as if saying them aloud caused her pain. Her eyes remained fixed to the floor, and there was a slight tremble in her shoulders, as though standing itself was a struggle. It was then that something in Eleanor's chest tightened, a feeling she couldn't quite shake. There was something about the way Lily held herself, the way she avoided eye contact, that set off an alarm in Eleanor's mind. "Are you sure, darling? You can sit next to me if you'd like." Eleanor's voice was gentle, inviting. Lily shook her head, her chestnut hair falling in uneven waves around her face. The movement was almost too quick, as though the thought of sitting down was something she couldn't even entertain. Eleanor studied her for a moment, her mind racing. There was no obvious reason why Lily wouldn't want to sit like the others. She didn't seem sick, nor was she behaving in a way that suggested she was merely being contrary. No, it was something deeper, something Eleanor knew she had to figure out. As the day continued, Miss Thompson kept a close eye on Lily. She watched as the little girl stood at the side of the room, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, her eyes still averted from the others. When the bell rang for recess, Lily was the last to leave the classroom, slipping quietly into the hallway without saying a word to anyone. Eleanor felt a pang of concern. There was something off about the way Lily interacted with the world around her, a quiet unease that had nothing to do with shyness. Later, as the day wore on, Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. She had seen signs like this before, small shifts in behavior that hinted at something hidden beneath the surface. As a teacher, she had encountered her fair share of troubled children, each carrying their own burdens, but there was something about Lily that felt different, something that whispered of deeper pain. She didn't know what it was yet, but she knew she had to pay attention. That evening, after the children had all gone home, Eleanor sat at her desk, a small leather-bound notebook open in front of her. She had kept the notebook for years, a practice she had developed early in her career. Each student had their own section, filled with notes and observations, small victories, and moments of concern. It was her way of tracking progress, but also a way of keeping a personal record of the children who passed through her classroom, the ones who left their mark on her heart. She flipped through the pages of Lily's section. The notes from the first 3 days were brief, observations about her quiet nature, her reluctance to join the other children in activities, and her constant refusal to sit. The patterns were already forming, and they were troubling. Eleanor's heart ached as she read through her own handwriting. Day 1. Refuses to sit during class. Day 2. Still standing. Doesn't join others for lunch. Keeps arms crossed. Day 3. Dark circles under eyes. No lunch again. Standing posture suggests pain. Eleanor closed the notebook and sighed deeply. She had learned early on that children didn't always speak their pain aloud. Sometimes it was in their actions, in the things they didn't say. And Lily Harper was saying a lot without ever opening her mouth. The next morning, Miss Thompson decided to speak with Lily's previous teacher, Mrs. Peters. During recess, she found her in the teacher's lounge, sipping her coffee and watching the children play through the window. Mrs. Peters, Eleanor began, her voice quiet. Have you noticed anything unusual about our new student, Lily Harper? Mrs. Peters looked up, her face thoughtful. Now that you mention it, I have. She's a quiet one, but there's something unsettling about the way she carries herself. I thought it might just be nerves, with the move and all. But now that you bring it up, I've noticed that she's been standing a lot too. Never sits down, even during quiet time. And did you see her lunch? She barely touches it. I just thought maybe she wasn't used to being around other kids, but it's more than that, isn't it? Eleanor nodded, her gut tightening. She had hoped it was just nerves, a simple adjustment period for the new girl. But deep down, she knew that wasn't the case. There was something darker behind Lily's actions, something she wasn't ready to admit to herself yet. But Miss Thompson wasn't one to ignore her instincts. She would get to the bottom of this, whatever it took. The days that followed were a blur of observations and quiet concern. Eleanor continued to watch Lily carefully, noticing every small detail. The way she flinched when a loud sound startled her, the way she avoided eye contact with everyone, and the way she would retreat to a corner whenever the other children gathered in groups. Lily wasn't just shy, she was withdrawing, and Eleanor had learned enough over the years to know that this wasn't just about a lack of social skills. This was something deeper, something far more painful. Eleanor had seen the signs before. She just hadn't expected to see them in Lily Harper. The days following Miss Thompson's initial concern about Lily seemed to drag on, each one blending into the next as she kept a vigilant eye on the quiet little girl. Lily's behavior grew more puzzling, and Miss Thompson's worry deepened. The once bright, energetic classroom that had always felt like a safe and nurturing space now seemed to carry an undercurrent of tension, especially when Lily was present. It wasn't just that Lily stood apart from the other children. It was the way she held herself, the subtle, almost imperceptible signs of distress that Miss Thompson had come to recognize in children who had suffered unseen traumas. She would often catch the little girl staring off into space, her face blank but her eyes distant, as though she were trapped in a world of her own. When the bell rang for lunch, Lily never joined the other children. Instead, she would remain at her desk, staring down at her hands, sometimes picking at her nails, sometimes running her fingers through her hair, as though trying to distract herself from some internal discomfort. Miss Thompson tried to engage her in conversation, as she did with all her students, but Lily's answers were always brief and barely audible. When Miss Thompson gently prodded her about her lunch, the response was always the same. "I'm not hungry, Miss Thompson." It was clear that something was wrong. But what? Was she just homesick? Was she adjusting to her new life after the tragedy that had taken her parents from her? Or was it something else entirely? Over the weekend, Miss Thompson found herself thinking about Lily constantly. She knew the story, of course. It was hard not to, given the Harper family's prominence in Willow Creek. The town seemed to revolve around them. Greg Harper, the successful real estate mogul, and his wife, Victoria, a well-known philanthropist who ran several local charity organizations. They were the kind of people who held power without ever needing to flaunt it. And then there was Lily, the quiet little girl who had suddenly become a part of their world after the tragic accident that had claimed the lives of her parents 6 months ago. The more Eleanor thought about it, the more she realized that she knew very little about Lily beyond the surface. The Harper family was well respected in Willow Creek, but the tragic death of Lily's parents had left the town with more questions than answers. No one talked much about what had happened, only that it was an accident. The kind of accident that left a child orphaned. But Eleanor wasn't someone who ignored the signs when a child was in need. She couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to Lily's story than the public knew. The quiet, withdrawn behavior, the reluctance to sit, the constant standing, it wasn't just grief. It was something else, and she was determined to find out what. On Monday, after the students returned from recess, Miss Thompson took a deep breath and approached the principal's office. She needed to know more about Lily's situation. She needed to understand what had really happened in the wake of the car accident. If there was a way to help Lily, to reach her, then she had to understand the root of her pain. Principal Warren was sitting behind his desk, papers scattered in front of him, his brow furrowed as he reviewed the day's schedule. He looked up as Miss Thompson entered, offering her a warm but distracted smile. "Good afternoon, Miss Thompson," he greeted her, his voice full of the practiced politeness that came with years of administrative experience. "What can I do for you today?" "Principal Warren," Eleanor began, her tone measured and serious. "I've been noticing some concerning behaviors with Lily Harper. She's not participating in class, refuses to sit down, and seems very withdrawn. I'm worried that something deeper might be going on with her. I was wondering if you could provide some background information on her situation. I know she's only been here a few days, but I feel like there's more to her story than we're seeing." Principal Warren shifted uncomfortably in his chair. He wasn't one to divulge personal details about students, especially those from prominent families, but there was something about Miss Thompson's quiet determination that made him pause. He knew her well enough to trust her instincts. "She's had a rough time, that's for sure," he said slowly, leaning back in his chair and folding his hands together. "Lily's parents died in a car accident on Route 16 about 6 months ago. It was a terrible situation. Unexpected. Tragic. From what I understand, he was the only survivor. She was in the car with them, but she was somehow spared. Since then, she's been living with her aunt and uncle, the Harper's extended family. They've been doing their best to help her adjust. But, well, I suppose grief isn't something that's easily overcome." Eleanor felt a lump form in her throat as she listened. The idea of a child losing both parents in such a sudden, violent way was heartbreaking enough. But the fact that Lily had been in the car, that she had survived while her parents had not, that must have left an imprint on her soul that no one could even begin to understand. Eleanor had heard about the accident, of course. The tragedy had shaken the entire town. But to hear it from the principal, to hear how deeply it had affected Lily, made the reality of it all the more tangible and all the more heartbreaking. "There's something else, though," Principal Warren continued, his voice lowering. "I don't know if it's something the family wants out in the open, but Lily's aunt and uncle, well, they're not exactly the most nurturing type. They're more concerned with their social status than with her well-being. From what I've heard, they don't quite know how to deal with her grief. There's been talk of therapy, but, well, they haven't followed through with it." Eleanor's heart sank as she processed his words. The Harper family might have been wealthy and influential in the community, but it was clear that they weren't offering the kind of support that Lily truly needed. She was an orphan, living with relatives who seemed more concerned with appearances than with helping a young girl heal from the trauma of losing everything. It was no wonder Lily was struggling. "Has anyone tried to talk to her about the accident? About what happened?" Eleanor asked, her voice quiet but firm. Principal Warren shook his head. Lily hasn't spoken much about it. She doesn't talk about her parents, and she avoids the topic when it's brought up. The Harpers have been very protective of her, but not in a way that helps her process her emotions. It's more about keeping her out of the public eye, away from the media, away from the town's prying eyes. Eleanor felt a deep, simmering frustration rise within her. Lily's grief wasn't being dealt with. If anything, it was being ignored. She could see the pieces coming together now. Lily wasn't refusing to sit because she was simply shy or anxious. She wasn't withdrawing because she was just having trouble adjusting. No, there was something deeper at play here. Lily was carrying a weight, a burden that no child her age should have to bear alone. Miss Thompson left Principal Warren's office with a new sense of determination. She couldn't change Lily's circumstances. No one could, but she could offer her something the child had yet to experience. A safe space, an environment where she could grieve, heal, and find comfort. It wouldn't be easy. It wouldn't be quick. But Eleanor knew she had to try. The next day, after a restless night of mulling over everything she had learned from Principal Warren, Miss Thompson made a quiet decision. It wasn't something she had planned to do, but it felt like the right course of action. She needed to do more than observe Lily from a distance. She needed to be there for her in a way that reached beyond the classroom walls. Lily's behaviors had become harder to ignore. The withdrawn posture, the refusal to join the class in activities, and the silent, unblinking gaze she sometimes wore, all of it painted a picture of a child in silent torment. Eleanor knew that children didn't just act this way for no reason. There had to be a source of pain, something deep and unspoken, and it wasn't going to go away on its own. So when the bell rang for recess that morning, Miss Thompson decided to act. She found herself walking toward Lily, who was once again standing by herself near the classroom door, her eyes distant as she watched the other children run and play. There was no hesitation in her step, no faltering in her decision. Eleanor had made up her mind. She couldn't let Lily continue to retreat further into herself, especially not when she was carrying a weight so heavy. "Lily," Miss Thompson called gently as she approached. The little girl's head turned, but her eyes didn't meet hers. Lily's face remained blank, her expression unreadable. "Would you like to come sit with me for a while?" Eleanor asked, her voice soft but firm, a contrast to the bustling chaos of the playground behind her. She didn't ask if Lily wanted to talk. She didn't push for anything more than what the girl was ready to give. She just offered a quiet presence, something Lily could choose if she felt ready. To Miss Thompson's surprise, Lily didn't immediately decline. Instead, she looked at the ground for a moment, hesitating. There was something vulnerable about that pause, something that spoke volumes without a word being said. Finally, after a long silence, Lily nodded. Eleanor smiled warmly and gestured toward the small bench just outside the classroom door. "Come sit with me," she said. "It's quiet here, just for a little while. We don't have to talk if you don't want to. I just thought you might like some peace." Lily followed her, her footsteps slow, almost as if she wasn't entirely sure what to expect from this invitation. They sat side by side on the bench, and for the first time in days, Miss Thompson felt the weight of the silence settle in a way that wasn't uncomfortable. She simply sat there, allowing the quiet to surround them both, her presence there like an anchor. The wind rustled through the leaves of the nearby trees, and the sounds of the playground faded into the background. For a while, neither of them spoke, but as the minutes ticked by, Miss Thompson noticed a subtle shift. Lily, who had been stiff and withdrawn, began to relax just a little. She no longer kept her arms wrapped tightly around herself. She slowly uncrossed her legs and leaned back slightly against the bench, as though the space between them was no longer filled with invisible walls. Miss Thompson knew she couldn't force Lily to open up. She had learned long ago that trust wasn't something that could be rushed. But this small step, this quiet time together, was progress. It was a start. And sometimes, a start was all that was needed. Finally, Lily spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. I'm not like the other kids." Miss Thompson's heart softened, but she kept her voice steady. "What do you mean, sweetie?" Lily shifted slightly, her hands fidgeting with the hem of her dress. "They laugh and play, and they don't know. They don't know what it's like." The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. Eleanor's heart clenched as she realized what Lily was trying to say. She wasn't just different in the way that children sometimes are, shy or reserved. She was carrying the unbearable weight of grief, of loss, in a way that others couldn't possibly understand. "You're right," Eleanor said softly. "They don't know what you've been through. But that doesn't mean you're alone. We can find ways to help you feel safe again, to help you find peace with all of this." Lily didn't respond right away, but her fingers slowly stopped twisting the fabric of her dress. She sat there, her body a little less tense than before. Miss Thompson's words hadn't solved everything. They hadn't made the pain go away. But for that brief moment, she could see a flicker of something in Lily's eyes, something that resembled hope. Maybe not a lot of hope, but just enough to begin a new kind of healing. Over the next few weeks, their time together on that bench became a routine. During recess, Lily would often walk to the quiet corner by the classroom where Eleanor sat, waiting with open arms but without pressure. Some days, Lily spoke a little more. Other days, she remained quiet. But every day, there was a subtle change. She began to smile more. It was a small thing, a brief upward curve of her lips, but it was enough to show that she was beginning to thaw, to let the world back in, little by little. Still, Eleanor knew that this was just the beginning. The deep wounds Lily carried weren't going to heal quickly, and they wouldn't heal by simply sitting on a bench together. But it was a start, and it was something. One afternoon, after school had ended and the children had scattered to their respective homes, Miss Thompson stayed behind to write in her notebook. She flipped open the page where Lily's notes were written, and as she reread the entries, she noticed something. For the first time, she could see a slight change in Lily's behavior. There were still no huge breakthroughs, no dramatic transformations, but the little things were there. Lily had started joining the other children for lunch. She had even participated in a few activities during class, and most notably, she had begun to sit down. Not for long, but enough to make Eleanor believe that she was starting to feel more comfortable. Miss Thompson's eyes lingered on Lily's section in her notebook, and she wrote one last note for the day. Day 12. Lily sat for the entire lesson today. No more standing. She smiled when she shared her drawing. Small steps, but important ones. She's beginning to trust again. It was a small victory, but it felt like a triumph. Eleanor knew that the road ahead would be long, and there would be days when the weight of grief would feel unbearable for Lily. But Miss Thompson was committed to being there for her, no matter how long it took. She was willing to offer that steady presence, the kind of support that didn't demand anything in return. Just as Lily needed to learn to trust again, Eleanor was willing to walk beside her every step of the way. As the weeks passed, the seasons in Willow Creek began to shift. The once crisp air of early autumn gave way to the soft golden warmth of late fall, with the trees shedding their leaves in a burst of vibrant color. The town, like many small towns, seemed to slow down a little as the weather turned cooler, the streets quieter as people prepared for the approaching winter. But inside the walls of Willow Creek Elementary, life went on. And for Lily Harper, the days were starting to feel just a little bit different. It wasn't that Lily had suddenly transformed into a carefree, playful child. No, that would take time, and Eleanor knew better than to expect such a quick fix. But there were moments now, small, quiet moments, that told Miss Thompson that Lily was healing in her own way. She had begun to join in class discussions, her voice soft but steady as she contributed when called upon. She had started sitting down without protest, something that had been a constant struggle at first. Lily would no longer stand in the corner of the room with her arms tightly crossed over her chest, her eyes cast downward in that guarded, distant manner. Slowly, she was rejoining the world around her. and it was a beautiful thing to witness. One morning, Miss Thompson watched as Lily sat at her desk, her back straight as she carefully colored a picture of a tree, its branches stretching across the page like fingers reaching out. It was the kind of drawing that showed a deeper understanding of space, of life beyond the simple lines children usually drew. It was a sign of the quiet determination that had begun to emerge from Lily. There was something about the way Lily held her crayons, the way she moved her hand, as though she were pouring all of her thoughts into the strokes. It was clear to Miss Thompson that Lily was learning to express herself in the only way she knew how, through her art. During the lunch period, Eleanor noticed something else. Lily, who had once refused to join the other children in the cafeteria, was now sitting at a table with a few of her classmates. She wasn't talking much, but she was present. That was the first step. Eleanor smiled to herself, her heart swelling with pride, as she watched the girl from afar. It wasn't long before the children began to accept Lily more fully into their fold. At first, they had been unsure of her, just as she had been unsure of them. But over time, they began to understand that Lily wasn't like the other kids in one key way. She had experienced a loss that no one her age should have to endure. The other children began to offer their support in their own childlike ways. They would bring her little notes during recess, scribbled on bright-colored paper, with messages that read things like, "You're my friend," or "We're glad you're here." It wasn't much, but it was enough to show that they were starting to accept her as part of their class, as part of their world. One day, near the end of November, a breakthrough came. The school was preparing for the annual Fall Festival, a tradition in Willow Creek that brought the entire community together. There were games, a pie-eating contest, music, and a bake sale. The children had been excited for weeks, eagerly discussing their roles in the event. But as the day approached, Eleanor noticed that Lily seemed more withdrawn than usual. She had been participating more in class, yes, but something about the festival seemed to unsettle her. On the morning of the festival, Miss Thompson approached Lily quietly. The girl was sitting at her desk, her hands resting in her lap, her expression vacant. Her art project from the previous day was still sitting unfinished on her desk. "Lily," Eleanor began gently, kneeling down so she was eye level with the girl. "How are you feeling about the festival today? It's going to be a lot of fun, I think." Lily didn't look up right away. She simply sat there, twisting a lock of her chestnut hair between her fingers. After a long pause, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't want to go," she said simply. Eleanor's heart tightened. She had seen this kind of reaction before in children who had suffered significant loss. The idea of celebrating, of participating in something joyful, could sometimes feel like an impossibility when you were carrying grief as heavy as Lily's. "Why don't you want to go, Lily?" Eleanor asked softly. She didn't want to push, but she needed to understand. Lily hesitated again, glancing up at her teacher with wide, troubled eyes. "Because I don't know how to be happy again. My mom and dad are gone. I don't know how to be happy when they're not here." The words fell from Lily's lips like fragile glass, shattering the silence between them. Eleanor felt her heart break all over again. She could see it now, the pain that still gripped Lily's heart, the confusion, the sadness that came from being a child without parents, without the people who were supposed to guide and protect you. It wasn't something that could be fixed with a simple gesture or a comforting word. But Eleanor had to try. "I understand, Lily," she said gently, her voice full of warmth. "I know it feels hard, and it's okay to feel sad. But you don't have to be happy all the time. You don't have to pretend. But sometimes it's okay to let yourself enjoy something, even just a little bit. You deserve to feel joy, even if it's only for a moment." Lily's gaze softened, and for the first time in days, Miss Thompson saw a flicker of hope in her eyes. "But what if it feels wrong?" Lily whispered, her voice trembling. "What if it's wrong to have fun when they're not here?" Eleanor reached out and gently placed her hand on Lily's, offering a reassuring touch. "It's not wrong to feel happiness, Lily. It's not wrong to take a break from your sadness. Your mom and dad, they would want you to be happy, and it's okay to carry your love for them with you while you enjoy things. They'll always be in your heart, but that doesn't mean you have to shut out all the good things too. The room seemed to hold its breath for a moment, the weight of the conversation settling over them both. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, Lily nodded slowly. "I'll try," she said quietly. "I'll try to go." It wasn't much, but it was everything. It was the first step toward allowing herself to feel something beyond grief, to give herself permission to enjoy life again, even just for a little while. When the festival began later that afternoon, Lily stood at the edge of the playground, watching the other children run around, their laughter and excitement filling the air. Miss Thompson watched from a distance, her heart swelling with a quiet pride. Lily wasn't fully there yet, but she had taken that first step. And for today, that was enough. Eleanor knew that there would be more hard days ahead, days when the grief would return like a heavy wave, threatening to pull Lily under. But she also knew that Lily wasn't alone anymore. She had people who cared about her, people who would be there to help her through the darkness. And with each passing day, Lily would learn that it was possible to carry both love and pain at the same time, that it was okay to let the light back in, even if only a little at a time. The days following the fall festival brought a quiet kind of change to Willow Creek Elementary. It wasn't anything drastic, but there was a noticeable shift in the air, something that felt both gentle and inevitable. Lily had begun to take small steps that Miss Thompson could see, things that weren't immediately obvious to the other children, but that were monumental in their own right. For the first time in months, Lily wasn't just walking through the motions. She was starting to engage with the world again, and that was a beautiful thing. One of the things Miss Thompson had come to realize was that there was no normal for Lily anymore. The world she had known, the world that included the simple joy of a mother's hug or the warmth of a father's voice, was gone. What was left in its place was a new reality, one that was filled with sorrow, uncertainty, and the daunting weight of loss. But there was something else too. Underneath it all, there was a flicker of resilience, something Eleanor saw glimmering in Lily's eyes whenever she was given the space to be herself. One chilly morning, as the first frost of winter covered the ground outside, Eleanor noticed Lily sitting at her desk, holding her pencil in a way that was so much more confident than it had been before. The little girl's posture was straighter, her eyes a little brighter. It wasn't perfect. There were still moments when she seemed lost in thought, or when the shadow of sadness would return, like an old friend. But today, it was as if Lily had decided that she was ready to try again. Eleanor had planned a lesson that day about resilience, about how people, no matter how young or old, could overcome the challenges that life threw at them. It was the kind of lesson that Miss Thompson believed in deeply, especially after all that she had learned in her years as a teacher. She had seen children face hardships that would break even the strongest of adults, and yet somehow, they still found a way to move forward. They didn't always do it perfectly, and sometimes they stumbled along the way, but they kept going. And that, she knew, was what made all the difference. "All right, class," Miss Thompson said as she stood at the front of the room. "Today, we're going to talk about something very important. How we can keep going even when things are tough." Lily was seated near the back, her eyes focused on the page in front of her, but her body language had shifted. Instead of the tense, guarded posture she had displayed only a few weeks ago, she was sitting with her shoulders slightly relaxed, her pencil moving steadily across the paper as she listened intently. "Resilience," Miss Thompson continued, "is when you keep trying, even when things are hard. It's when you get back up after you fall down, and you keep going, even when you don't know if you can. It's a strength inside of you that helps you move forward." Lily's eyes flicked up to meet Miss Thompson's for a brief moment, and for the first time, there was a hint of recognition in her gaze, as though the words were starting to resonate with her in a way they hadn't before. "Does anyone know what it means to be resilient?" Eleanor asked the class, looking around the room. She wasn't expecting everyone to have an answer, but she was hoping to spark a conversation. One of the other children, Emma, raised her hand eagerly. It's like when you don't give up, right? Like when you keep trying even if you fail. Exactly, Miss Thompson said with a smile. It's about never giving up, no matter how hard things get. And sometimes being resilient isn't about being strong all the time. Sometimes it's about asking for help when you need it. There was a slight pause as the students absorbed this idea. Then, as if on cue, Lily's hand hesitantly shot up. Miss Thompson's heart skipped a beat. It had been weeks since Lily had spoken up in class, and it took a moment for Eleanor to steady herself before acknowledging the little girl. Yes, Lily, Miss Thompson said, her voice gentle but encouraging. Lily's face was flushed with a mix of nerves and determination. She looked around at her classmates, as if gathering her courage, before speaking in a soft but steady voice. Sometimes it feels like I can't keep going, like there's a wall inside me that won't let me move forward. But I think I can learn to climb it. Slowly, the room went quiet, the weight of her words settling over everyone. For a moment, no one said anything, as if they were all processing what Lily had just shared. Miss Thompson felt a lump form in her throat, and she had to swallow before speaking. That's a beautiful way to think about it, Lily, she said softly. Climbing a wall, slowly but surely. You don't have to do it all at once. It's okay to take small steps, and no matter how long it takes, I promise you, you can do it. You are so much stronger than you realize. Lily nodded slowly, her eyes still on her desk, but her fingers gripped her pencil a little more firmly. It was a small change, but it was huge in the context of everything Lily had been through. For the first time, it seemed like Lily was beginning to accept the idea that healing was not a race, and that it was okay to go at her own pace. The rest of the class continued on, but Eleanor couldn't help but steal a glance at Lily every so often. She noticed that the little girl had started to look at her classmates differently. She was no longer the isolated child who kept to herself, and she wasn't the silent, distant figure who had avoided making connections. She had become a part of the class, quietly but surely finding her place in the world again. And though Miss Thompson knew that Lily still had a long way to go, still had nights where the grief would feel overwhelming and mornings where the weight of loss would threaten to pull her under, there was a new light in the little girl's eyes. It wasn't a bright, flashy kind of light, but a quiet, steady glow that suggested something profound was happening. For the first time in a long while, Lily was starting to believe that she could heal. And while it might take time, while it might be hard and filled with moments of doubt, Miss Thompson knew in her heart that Lily would get there. With every little step, with every quiet victory, she was learning to climb that wall. Slowly, but surely. The rest of the day passed by in a blur for Miss Thompson, but when the final bell rang, signaling the end of the school day, she stayed behind for a moment. She watched her students gather their belongings and say goodbye, but her gaze was fixed on Lily. The little girl stood by the door, her backpack slung over one shoulder, looking out at the world beyond the classroom. There was a faint smile on her face as she glanced back at Miss Thompson, a smile that was small but full of hope. "Good night, Miss Thompson," Lily said quietly. "Good night, Lily," Miss Thompson replied, her voice thick with emotion. "I'll see you tomorrow." And as Lily walked out the door, Eleanor felt something shift inside her, something that felt like a promise, like a quiet assurance that Lily was going to be okay. Not today, not in some grand, sweeping way, but in the little moments, in the steady progress, she was finding her way back to herself. And that, Eleanor thought, was everything. Winter settled over Willow Creek in a blanket of snow, transforming the town into a serene winter wonderland. The days grew shorter, and the once golden leaves had turned to ice crystals, glistening under the pale winter sun. It was a season of quiet reflection, and it seemed as though the world was holding its breath, waiting for something to shift. And perhaps, in its own way, something was shifting for Lily. The holiday season was approaching, and with it came a mixture of excitement and trepidation. For many of the children in Miss Thompson's class, the holidays were a time for celebration. It was a time of joy, of family gatherings, of baking cookies and making memories. But for Lily, the holidays had a different meaning. The Christmas decorations in the halls of Willow Creek Elementary seemed to mock her grief, the twinkling lights on the tree not a source of warmth, but a painful reminder of everything she had lost. Lily had never known a world without the comfort of her parents, their presence weaving through the holidays like the songs they would sing, the way they would decorate the house with care, making it a place of warmth and love. But now, Lily found herself in a world where that warmth no longer existed, and the approaching Christmas felt like an insurmountable mountain. She hadn't spoken much about her parents in the weeks since the fall festival, but Miss Thompson could see the way the holidays brought a quiet sadness to the little girl's eyes. She was trying so hard to fit in, to play the part of a normal child, but Miss Thompson knew better. Grief, especially for someone so young, wasn't something that could be hidden away forever. It was the first week of December when the school sent out a letter about the upcoming Christmas concert. The students were going to perform a few songs for the parents and the community. Everyone was excited, chattering about costumes, practices, and how much fun it would be to sing together. But Lily didn't seem to share in their enthusiasm. Every time the subject came up, she seemed to retreat even further into herself. Her responses became quieter, more withdrawn. One morning, as Miss Thompson watched her class preparing for the concert, she noticed Lily at her desk, staring out the window, her hands folded in her lap. She wasn't participating in the group practice, the way the other children were eagerly rehearsing the songs, their voices rising with excitement. No, Lily was still, her face reflecting the same quiet sorrow Miss Thompson had seen before. After class, Miss Thompson approached her gently. "Lily, how are you feeling about the concert?" Lily's eyes didn't meet hers, instead focusing on the snowflakes gently falling outside. "I don't want to sing," she said quietly. "I can't. It feels wrong." Miss Thompson's heart ached for the little girl, who was caught in a struggle between the desire to be like the other children and the overwhelming pain that kept her tethered to a past she couldn't escape. It wasn't that Lily didn't want to try, but the weight of her grief was so heavy that even the simplest of activities, like singing with her classmates, felt impossible. "I understand," Miss Thompson said softly, kneeling down beside her. "I know that this time of year is hard for you, and I want you to know that it's okay to feel that way. But I also want you to know that you don't have to do it alone." Lily remained silent, her fingers tracing the edge of her desk as though lost in thought. Miss Thompson paused, allowing the silence to linger between them. It was in these moments that Miss Thompson learned to read Lily's subtle signals, to wait for the small shifts in her body language, the way her posture would soften or her eyes would flutter as though she was beginning to trust again. "Lily," Miss Thompson said gently, "you don't have to sing if you're not ready, but I would love for you to be there with us. You don't have to be in the spotlight. You can just sit with us, watch, and enjoy the music if you want." The words hung in the air, not pressing, but offering an open door. Miss Thompson wasn't asking Lily to perform or pretend she wasn't struggling. She was offering her space, a space to be part of something, even if it wasn't in the way others expected. Lily's gaze slowly lifted, and for the first time in what felt like weeks, her eyes met Miss Thompson's. There was something fragile in that look, something that spoke volumes about the girl's inner turmoil. I don't know if I can be happy," Lily whispered. Miss Thompson smiled softly, the warmth of her understanding filling the space between them. "You don't have to be happy all the time, Lily. But it's okay to let little moments of happiness in, even if just for a moment. The world doesn't expect you to be perfect. It just needs you to be you." Lily sat quietly for a moment, her brow furrowing as though she was contemplating the idea. Then, after what seemed like an eternity, she nodded slowly. "Okay," she said softly. "I'll try." And that was enough. It wasn't a grand breakthrough, but it was a step. It was a willingness to show up, even when everything inside her screamed to stay away. The day of the concert arrived, and the school gymnasium was filled with excited families, bustling with chatter and the soft hum of anticipation. The children were all dressed in their holiday best, their faces flushed with excitement, ready to share their songs with the world. The stage was decorated with garlands of holly, and a giant Christmas tree stood in the corner, its twinkling lights casting a soft glow on everything around it. Lily was there, sitting quietly in the front row of the audience with Miss Thompson by her side. She wasn't standing with the other children. She wasn't singing, but she was present. And for now, that was enough. As the children took their places on stage and began to sing, their voices filling the room with warmth and joy, Miss Thompson stole a glance at Lily. The little girl's eyes were fixed on the stage, her expression thoughtful. There were no tears, no signs of distress. She wasn't fully smiling, but she wasn't frowning either. She was simply watching, absorbing, and perhaps, just perhaps, feeling a little less alone. As the last song came to an end, the children received a round of applause. Miss Thompson stood and clapped along with the rest of the crowd, her heart swelling with pride for her students, for their bravery, and for their resilience. She turned to Lily, who was still seated quietly beside her, and smiled. "You did it," Miss Thompson said softly. "You were here, and that's enough." Lily looked up at her, a faint smile tugging at the corner of her lips. It wasn't a big smile, not the kind that lit up the room, but it was a start. It was a glimmer of hope, a sign that Lily was beginning to understand that she didn't have to be perfect to be loved, to be accepted. She was allowed to take things at her own pace, and that was more than enough. As the evening wore on, and the families began to leave, Miss Thompson watched Lily stand up and slowly make her way to the door. She didn't run or laugh with the other children, but she wasn't hiding anymore, either. She was simply walking, taking one small step after another. And for the first time, Miss Thompson felt a deep, quiet certainty in her heart. Lily wasn't just surviving. She was beginning to live again.